On the morning of March 7th, 1983, a woman named Elena Mikhailovna Sokolova walked into a cramped office at the State Bank of the USSR on Neglinaya Street in Moscow and handed a teller a single United States $1 bill. She wanted to exchange it for rubles. The transaction should have been routine, unremarkable, the kind of bureaucratic interaction that occurred dozens of times each day in a city where foreign currency represented both practical value and symbolic contamination. But this particular dollar bill, serial number L47298632A, would trigger a counterintelligence investigation that would dismantle one of the most sophisticated CIA operations running inside the Soviet Union during the final years of the Cold War. Elena Sokolova was 61 years old. She had worked for 37 years as a telephone switchboard operator at the Ministry of Foreign Trade, a mid-level position that required security clearance but offered little prestige and modest compensation. She lived alone in a two-room apartment in the Izmailovo district, a concrete residential complex built during the Khrushchev era that housed thousands of families in identical units stacked 12 stories high. Her husband had died in 1976 from complications related to diabetes, and her only child, a son named Dmitry, worked as a civil engineer in Novosibirsk, more than 1,700 miles east of Moscow. They spoke by telephone once a month, usually on Sundays, conversations that lasted no more than 10 minutes due to the cost of long-distance calls and the stilted formality that had developed between them over years of separation. Elena's routine was predictable. She woke each morning at 6:15, prepared tea and black bread with margarine, listened to state radio while getting dressed, and left her apartment at 7:30 to catch the trolleybus that would take her to the ministry building on Smolenskaya Ploshchad. She worked from 8 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon, 6 days a week, with Sundays off. Her job required her to connect calls between ministry officials and their counterparts in foreign trade offices, embassies, and international organizations. The work was tedious, isolating, performed in a small windowless room with 3 other operators, all women of similar age and background. They rarely spoke to one another beyond what was necessary to coordinate shift changes or report technical problems with the switchboard equipment. On the evening of March 4th, 1983, Elena had been walking home from the trolleybus stop when she noticed something unusual on the sidewalk near the entrance to her apartment building. It was a crumpled piece of paper, folded several times and partially obscured by dirt and melting snow. She might have walked past it entirely, but the wind shifted at that moment and the paper moved slightly, catching her attention. She bent down, her knees protesting the movement, and picked it up. When she unfolded it, she found a $1 bill inside, crisp and clean despite the dirty wrapper, with a handwritten note in Russian that said simply, "For your kindness." Elena stood there on the sidewalk, holding the dollar and the note, trying to make sense of what she had found. She looked around, scanning the faces of people passing by, wondering if someone had dropped it accidentally or if this was some kind of deliberate act. But no one seemed to be paying attention to her. The street was filled with the usual evening commuters, workers returning home, a few elderly women carrying shopping bags, children in heavy coats running ahead of their parents. No one looked suspicious. No one looked like they were watching her. She folded the dollar back into the paper and slipped it into her coat pocket. When she reached her apartment, she placed it on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. She had no idea who might have left it or why the note said, "For your kindness," when she could not recall doing anything particularly kind for anyone recently. She thought back through the past several days, trying to remember if she had helped someone, given directions to a lost tourist, assisted an elderly neighbor with groceries. But nothing came to mind. Her interactions with other people were minimal, transactional, rarely extending beyond the necessary exchanges required by her work or the basic courtesies of living in close proximity to others. The dollar troubled her. Possession of foreign currency was not illegal in the Soviet Union by 1983, but it was unusual and potentially suspicious. Foreign currency could be used in special shops called Beryozka stores, where imported goods unavailable to ordinary citizens could be purchased, but access to these stores required not just foreign currency, but also documentation proving the currency had been obtained legally, usually through travel abroad or employment with an international organization. Elena had neither. She had never traveled outside the Soviet Union, and her work at the ministry, while involving international communications, did not provide her with any legitimate access to foreign currency. For 2 days, the dollar remained on her kitchen table. She would look at it each morning before leaving for work, and each evening when she returned home. She considered throwing it away, but that seemed wasteful. She considered giving it to a neighbor, but that would require explaining where it came from, and she had no good explanation. Finally, on the morning of March 7th, she decided to exchange it at the state bank. She reasoned that exchanging it would make the situation official, documented, and therefore less suspicious than simply keeping it hidden in her apartment. The teller at the state bank was a young man in his mid-20s named Oleg Petrovich Kravtsov. He had been working at the bank for less than a year, assigned to the foreign currency exchange window after completing his mandatory military service and a brief training period. When Elena handed him the dollar and her internal passport, Oleg examined both carefully. The passport confirmed her identity and address. The dollar appeared genuine, though Oleg had limited experience with American currency and relied primarily on checking that the paper quality and printing seemed consistent with the few other dollars he had processed in recent months. The exchange rate that day was $1 to 83 kopecks, the official state rate that bore little relationship to the black market rate, but was the only legal rate available for transactions conducted through state institutions. Oleg filled out the required paperwork, recording Elena's name, passport number, the serial number of the dollar bill, the date, and the amount of rubles being provided in exchange. Elena signed the form, received her 83 kopecks, and left the bank. Under normal circumstances, the transaction would have ended there. But Oleg Petrovich Kravtsov was not simply a bank teller. He was also an informant for the second chief directorate of the KGB, the division responsible for internal counterintelligence and surveillance of foreign intelligence activities within Soviet borders. Oleg had been recruited during his military service after a routine background check revealed that his uncle, a man he barely knew, had been arrested in 1972 for economic crimes related to black market trading. The KGB officer who approached Oleg had been clear. His family connection to a convicted criminal did not make him a suspect, but it did make him vulnerable to pressure from others who might try to exploit that connection. By agreeing to serve as an informant, Oleg would demonstrate his loyalty to the state and protect himself from potential complications in the future. Oleg's role as an informant was passive. He was not required to actively investigate anyone or conduct surveillance. His instructions were simple. If he observed anything unusual in the course of his work at the bank, particularly involving foreign currency transactions, he was to report it to his KGB contact, a man named Anatoly Ivanovich Zhukov, who worked out of a nondescript office building near Lubyanka Square. Unusual was defined broadly. Transactions involving large amounts of foreign currency, repeated exchanges by the same individual, currency with unusual markings or serial numbers, anything that deviated from the typical patterns Oleg had been trained to recognize. The transaction with Elena Sokolova did not immediately strike Oleg as unusual. The amount was small, just $1, and Elena herself seemed like an ordinary elderly woman conducting a routine exchange. But something about the dollar itself caught Oleg's attention when he examined it more closely after Elena had left. On the back of the bill, in the lower left corner near the serial number, there was a small pencil mark, barely visible, a tiny dot no larger than the period at the end of a sentence. It could have been accidental, a stray mark made by someone handling the bill carelessly. But Oleg had been trained to notice such details, and in his brief career as an informant, he had learned that small anomalies sometimes indicated larger patterns. That afternoon, during his lunch break, Oleg walked to a public telephone 2 blocks from the bank and called the number he had been given for Anatoly Zhukov. The call was brief. Oleg reported the transaction, described the pencil mark, and provided Elena's name and passport number. Zhukov told him to hold on to the dollar bill and not to process it into the regular currency inventory. Someone would come by the bank later that day to collect it. At 4:30 in the afternoon, a man in a dark coat arrived at the bank and identified himself to Oleg as Zhukov's colleague. He did not provide a name. Oleg handed over the dollar bill, along with the transaction paperwork that included Elena's information. The man placed the bill in a small plastic evidence bag, thanked Oleg for his diligence, and left without further conversation. The dollar was delivered to the KGB's Technical Analysis Laboratory in the basement of the Lubyanka building later that evening. The laboratory was staffed by specialists trained in document examination, cryptography, and the detection of covert communication methods. The dollar was photographed under various lighting conditions, examined under magnification, and tested for the presence of invisible inks or chemical substances that might indicate it had been used as part of a covert messaging system. The initial analysis confirmed that the pencil mark in the lower left corner was deliberate. Under magnification, it was clear that the mark had been made with care, placed precisely in a location that would not be immediately obvious to casual observation, but would be visible to someone looking for it. Further examination revealed 2 additional marks, both microscopic, one near the upper right corner and another near the center of the bill. These marks were made with a different instrument, possibly a fine needle or pin, creating tiny indentations in the paper that were only visible under specific angles of light. The pattern of marks matched a known covert communication technique used by Western intelligence services, particularly the CIA, to signal the status or location of dead drops. A dead drop was a method of exchanging information or materials between an intelligence officer and an asset without requiring face-to-face contact. One party would leave an item at a predetermined location, and the other party would retrieve it later. Signals were used to indicate when a dead drop was loaded, when it had been cleared, or when a meeting was required. The marks on the dollar bill suggested it had been used as such a signal, though the specific meaning of the marks would require additional analysis and cross-referencing with other known cases. By March 8th, Elena Sokolova had become the subject of a full counterintelligence investigation. A surveillance team was assigned to monitor her movements, document her contacts, and search for any indication that she was involved in espionage activities. The team consisted of 4 officers, 2 men and 2 women, who rotated shifts to maintain continuous observation without becoming too familiar to Elena or her neighbors. They photographed everyone she spoke to, recorded the times she left and returned to her apartment, and noted any deviations from her established routine. For the first week, the surveillance revealed nothing unusual. Elena followed her typical schedule: work, home, occasional stops at a grocery store or pharmacy, no contact with anyone who appeared suspicious. She did not use public telephones, did not visit locations known to be associated with foreign intelligence activities, and did not exhibit any behavior that suggested she was aware of being watched. But on March 15th, Elena received a telephone call at her apartment that triggered immediate concern among the surveillance team. The call came in at 7:45 in the evening during a time when Elena was typically at home preparing dinner. One of the surveillance officers, stationed in a vehicle outside her building, was monitoring her telephone line through a tap that had been installed by KGB technicians the previous week. The call was brief, lasting less than 2 minutes, and the conversation was cryptic. The caller was a man who did not identify himself. He asked Elena if she had received the package he had left for her. Elena, sounding confused, said she had found something on the street near her apartment, but did not know who it was from. The man said he was glad she had found it, that it was a small thank you for her help with a matter he did not specify. Elena asked what help he was referring to, and the man said it was better not to discuss details over the telephone, that he hoped she was well, and that he would be in touch again soon. Then he hung up. The surveillance officer listening to the call immediately contacted Anatoly Zhukov, who ordered the team to intensify their monitoring. A second team was brought in to assist, increasing the number of officers assigned to the case to 8. Audio surveillance was expanded to include not just Elena's telephone, but also directional microphones aimed at her apartment windows, allowing the KGB to record conversations taking place inside her home. Over the next several days, Elena received 2 more telephone calls from the same man. The calls followed a similar pattern. The man would ask vague questions about her well-being, mention that he appreciated her discretion, and then end the conversation before Elena could ask for clarification. Elena, for her part, seemed genuinely confused by the calls. After each one, she would sit at her kitchen table, clearly troubled, talking to herself in a way that suggested she was trying to make sense of something that made no sense to her. The KGB's analysis of the telephone calls focused on identifying the caller. The voice was male, middle-aged, speaking Russian with an accent that specialists identified as possibly Baltic, suggesting the caller might be from Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania. However, the accent could also have been deliberately affected to disguise the caller's true origin. Attempts to trace the calls were unsuccessful. Each call was made from a different public telephone in various parts of Moscow, and by the time surveillance teams could be dispatched to those locations, the caller had already left. On March 23rd, Elena was approached by 2 KGB officers while she was walking home from work. The approach was conducted carefully, designed to appear routine rather than threatening. The officers identified themselves, showed their credentials, and asked if Elena would be willing to come to their office to answer a few questions about a matter related to her work at the ministry. They emphasized that she was not under arrest, that this was simply a voluntary interview, and that they would provide transportation to and from the office. Elena, frightened but compliant, agreed. She was taken to a building on Varsnofievsky Lane, a nondescript structure that housed one of several KGB interrogation facilities in central Moscow. She was placed in a small room with a table, 3 chairs, and a recording device that was visible on the table. Its presence meant to inform her that everything she said would be documented. Anatoly Zhukov conducted the interview, accompanied by a female officer named Svetlana Andreevna Lebedeva, whose role was to take notes and provide a less intimidating presence to balance Zhukov's more direct approach. The interview began with basic questions about Elena's background, her work, her family, her daily routine. Elena answered truthfully, her voice steady but her hands shaking slightly as she clasped them together on the table. Then Zhukov shifted to the dollar bill. He asked Elena where she had obtained it. Elena explained that she had found it on the street near her apartment on March 4th, wrapped in a piece of paper with a note that said, "For your kindness." Zhukov asked if she had any idea who might have left it. Elena said she did not. Zhukov asked if she had done anything recently that someone might consider kind. Elena struggled to answer, eventually admitting that she could not think of anything specific. Zhukov then asked about the telephone calls. Elena's expression changed, confusion giving way to something closer to fear. She admitted that she had received several calls from a man she did not know, that the calls had made her uncomfortable, that she did not understand what the man wanted or why he was contacting her. Zhukov asked if the man had ever asked her to do anything. Elena said no, that the calls had been brief and vague, that the man had never made any specific requests. The interview continued for 3 hours. Zhukov asked the same questions multiple times, phrased in different ways, searching for inconsistencies in Elena's answers, but her story remained consistent. She was a woman who had found a dollar bill on the street, exchanged it at a bank, and then received mysterious telephone calls from someone she did not know. She had no explanation for why this was happening to her. At the end of the interview, Zhukov told Elena that she was free to go, but that she should expect to be contacted again if additional questions arose. He also instructed her, in a tone that was more warning than suggestion, that she should not discuss this interview with anyone, not her neighbors, not her colleagues at work, not her son in Novosibirsk. Elena nodded, signed a statement confirming what she had told them, and was driven back to her apartment. But Elena Sokolova was not the target of the investigation. The KGB had concluded, based on her responses during the interview and the months of surveillance that had revealed no suspicious behavior prior to finding the dollar, that she was an unwitting participant in someone else's operation. The real target was the man who had been calling her, and more broadly, the intelligence network that was using marked currency as part of a signaling system. The technical analysis of the dollar bill had provided additional information. The serial number L47298632A was traced through banking records to a batch of currency that had been printed by the United States Bureau of Engraving and Printing in 1981 and distributed through the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. From there, the trail became more difficult to follow, but intelligence sharing arrangements between the KGB and certain Eastern European security services provided a critical lead. In December of 1982, 3 months before Elena found the dollar on the street, Polish security services had intercepted a letter being sent from Warsaw to an address in West Berlin. The letter, which appeared to be routine personal correspondence, had been flagged for inspection because the sender's name matched that of a known CIA contact. When the letter was examined under ultraviolet light, hidden writing was revealed, describing a meeting that had taken place in October between a CIA officer operating under diplomatic cover and a Polish national who had been providing information about Soviet military activities in Poland. The letter also mentioned a payment of $500 that had been made to the Polish source, and it included serial numbers for 10 of those bills, which the CIA officer had recorded for his own accounting purposes. One of those serial numbers matched the dollar bill that Elena had found. The KGB's analysis concluded that the dollar was part of a batch of currency that had been provided to a CIA asset in Eastern Europe, and that the marks on the bill were signals indicating the status of a dead drop operation running inside the Soviet Union. The fact that the dollar had ended up on a street in Moscow suggested that the asset had either deliberately placed it there as a signal or had lost it accidentally while preparing to execute a dead drop. The investigation expanded to identify the asset. Surveillance was intensified not just on Elena Sokolova, but on everyone who lived in her apartment building and everyone who worked in her section of the Ministry of Foreign Trade. The KGB reviewed months of telephone logs, travel records, and financial transactions, searching for patterns that might indicate someone was engaged in espionage. On April 2nd, the breakthrough came. One of Elena's colleagues at the ministry switchboard, a woman named Irina Vladimirovna Kuznetsova, was observed making a dead drop in Gorky Park. Irina was 54 years old, married to a factory foreman, and had worked at the ministry for 18 years. She had an unblemished record, no history of political dissent, no obvious vulnerabilities that would have made her a candidate for recruitment by a foreign intelligence service. But the KGB surveillance team watched as she walked through the park on a Sunday afternoon, paused at a specific bench near the pond, and placed a folded newspaper under the bench before continuing her walk. 30 minutes later, a man approached the bench, sat down briefly, retrieved the newspaper, and walked away. The man was identified through photographic surveillance as a second secretary at the United States Embassy in Moscow, a position that was commonly used as cover for CIA officers operating under diplomatic immunity. His name was Thomas Edward Harris, and he had been in Moscow for 14 months. The newspaper was recovered by KGB officers before Harris could leave the park. Inside was a handwritten note containing information about an upcoming meeting of senior ministry officials to discuss trade agreements with Western European countries, including the names of the officials who would attend, the date and location of the meeting, and a summary of the topics that would be discussed. The information was classified not at the highest levels, but sensitive enough that its disclosure to American intelligence would provide useful insight into Soviet negotiating positions. Irina Kuznetsova was arrested on April 5th at her apartment. The arrest was conducted at 5 in the morning, the standard time for such operations, designed to catch suspects before they were fully awake and less likely to resist or destroy evidence. KGB officers searched her apartment and found additional materials, including a miniature camera hidden inside a hollowed-out book, several rolls of undeveloped film, and a small amount of foreign currency, approximately $200 in various denominations, hidden inside a jar of flour in her kitchen. The interrogation of Irina Kuznetsova lasted for weeks. Unlike Elena Sokolova, Irina was not a confused bystander. She was a trained asset, recruited by the CIA in 1979 during a trade delegation trip to Vienna, where she had been part of a support staff assisting Soviet negotiators. The recruitment had been gradual, beginning with social contact at a reception, followed by subsequent meetings framed as friendly conversations, and eventually progressing to a formal approach by a CIA officer who identified himself and asked if Irina would be willing to provide information to the United States government. Irina's motivation, according to her confession, had been primarily ideological. She had become disillusioned with the Soviet system after years of watching corruption and incompetence within the ministry, and she had been persuaded by the CIA officer's argument that helping the United States would contribute to eventual reform and the possibility of a better future for the Soviet people. The money had been secondary, a means of supporting her family rather than the primary reason for her cooperation. Over the next 4 years, Irina had photographed hundreds of documents that passed through the ministry switchboard using the miniature camera the CIA had provided. She would photograph the documents late at night after her colleagues had left, in the small windowless room where the switchboard equipment was located. The dead drop in Gorky Park had been her primary method of passing the film to her CIA handler, with signals arranged through a system involving marked currency. When a dollar bill with specific marks appeared in a predetermined location, it meant a dead drop was loaded and ready to be cleared. When the drop had been successfully cleared, a different marked bill would appear as confirmation. The dollar that Elena Sokolova had found was one of those signal bills. Irina had been carrying it in her coat pocket, intending to place it on a specific park bench to signal that she had loaded a dead drop, but the bill had fallen out of her pocket without her noticing, likely when she was reaching for something else. The bill had landed on the sidewalk near Elena's apartment building, where Elena had found it the following day. The trial of Irina Kuznetsova was held in a closed military court in June of 1983. She was charged with treason under Article 64 of the RSFSR criminal code, the same statute that had been used to prosecute hundreds of other Soviet citizens accused of espionage during the Cold War. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The documents she had photographed, the camera, the foreign currency, her own detailed confession. There was no realistic possibility of acquittal. On June 28th, Irina Vladimirovna Kuznetsova was found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in a labor camp, a sentence that was considered relatively lenient given the severity of the charges. The leniency was attributed to her cooperation during interrogation and the fact that the information she had provided to the CIA while classified had not resulted in any deaths or catastrophic security breaches. She was transferred to a camp in the Perm region, approximately 700 miles east of Moscow, where she would spend the next decade performing manual labor under harsh conditions. Thomas Edward Harris, the CIA officer who had been handling Irina, was declared persona non grata by the Soviet government and expelled from the country within 48 hours of Irina's arrest. The United States government issued a formal protest denying that Harris had been involved in espionage and claiming that his expulsion was politically motivated, but the protest was pro forma, a diplomatic formality that everyone understood would lead nowhere. Harris returned to the United States and was quietly reassigned to a desk job at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, effectively ending his career as a field officer. The CIA operation that had been running through Irina Kuznetsova was dismantled. Other assets in Moscow who had been using similar dead-drop methods were either extracted or instructed to cease all contact with their handlers until new, secure communication protocols could be established. The loss of Irina represented not just the end of one source, but the compromise of an entire methodology that the CIA had been using successfully for years. Elena Sokolova was never charged with any crime. The KGB concluded that she had been genuinely unaware of the significance of the dollar bill she had found, and that her role in the case had been entirely accidental. However, her life was irrevocably changed by the investigation. She was questioned multiple times over the following months, her apartment was searched twice, and her colleagues at the ministry began to avoid her, fearful that association with someone who had been involved, however innocently, in an espionage case might bring unwanted scrutiny onto them as well. In September of 1983, Elena was transferred from her position at the ministry switchboard to a lower-level clerical job in a different department, a move that was officially described as a routine administrative reassignment, but was understood by everyone involved to be a punishment for her connection to the Kuznetsova case. Her salary was reduced, her access to classified materials was revoked, and she was placed under periodic monitoring by KGB officers who would occasionally visit her apartment without warning to ask if she had been contacted by anyone unusual or if she had anything to report. Elena Mikhailovna Sokolova retired from government service in 1987 at the age of 65. She lived for another 12 years in her small apartment in Izmailovo, supported by a modest pension that barely covered her basic expenses. She rarely left her home except to buy groceries or visit a nearby clinic for medical treatment. Her son Dmitry visited twice during those years, brief, awkward visits where neither of them spoke about what had happened in 1983. Elena died in June of 1999 from heart failure. She was 77 years old. There was no obituary, no public acknowledgement of her passing beyond a brief notation in municipal death records. The dollar bill, serial number L4 7298632A, remained in KGB archives, stored in a sealed evidence envelope along with the case files documenting the investigation and prosecution of Irina Kuznetsova. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, many such files were declassified or lost in the chaos of institutional reorganization, but this particular file remained classified until 2007, when a Russian journalist researching Cold War espionage cases obtained partial access through a Freedom of Information request. The journalist's article, published in a small Moscow periodical, noted the ironic cruelty of the case that an elderly telephone operator who had committed no crime had spent the final years of her working life under suspicion and social isolation because she had picked up a piece of paper from the street, and that her act of turning that paper into the bank, an act she believed to be the responsible and legal thing to do, had triggered an investigation that destroyed the life of her colleague and exposed an intelligence operation that had taken years to build. The story received little attention beyond academic circles and the small community of researchers interested in Cold War history. But the case files revealed something important about how intelligence operations function, and more significantly, how fragile they are. A single dropped dollar bill, marked with microscopic symbols that meant nothing to the person who found it, had been enough to unravel years of careful planning, to end careers, to send one woman to a labor camp and to mark another woman as permanently suspect in the eyes of her government. Irina Kuznetsova was released from the labor camp in 1993 under a general amnesty program implemented after the Soviet Union's collapse. She was 58 years old, her health permanently damaged by the conditions of her imprisonment. She returned to Moscow, but found that her husband had divorced her during her incarceration and remarried. Her children, both adults by then, maintained minimal contact with her, unwilling or unable to reconcile the mother they remembered with the woman who had been convicted of treason. Irina found work as a cleaner in a small office building, the only employment available to someone with her background. She lived in a communal apartment in the outskirts of the city, sharing a kitchen and bathroom with 3 other families. She died in 2001 from complications related to tuberculosis, a disease she had contracted in the labor camp. She was 66 years old. Thomas Edward Harris, the CIA officer who had recruited and handled Irina, left the agency in 1987 after a performance review determined that his operational security had been inadequate, that he should have been more careful about the signaling methods he had established with his asset, and that the loss of Irina represented a preventable failure. He worked briefly as a consultant for a private security firm before retiring completely from any work related to intelligence. He refused all requests for interviews about his time in Moscow, and according to people who knew him in his later years, he never spoke about the case, not even to family members. He died in 2015 at the age of 73. The case of the dollar bill is not taught in intelligence training programs, not officially documented in any CIA operational handbook, and rarely discussed even among retired officers who worked counterintelligence cases during the Cold War. But among those who do know the story, it serves as a cautionary reminder of how operations fail, not always because of sophisticated enemy surveillance or brilliant counterintelligence work, but sometimes because of accidents, because someone dropped something they should have been more careful with, because the mechanisms of covert communication, no matter how carefully designed, are always vulnerable to the unpredictable chaos of human error. Elena Sokolova never knew that the dollar bill she found had contained markings. She never knew that it had been part of an intelligent signaling system, or that turning it into the bank had triggered an investigation that ended with her colleague being sent to a labor camp. She spent the last years of her life believing that she had somehow done something wrong, that the KGB's interest in her had been justified, that she was in some way guilty, even though she could not understand what her guilt consisted of. And perhaps that was the cruelest consequence of all, that an innocent woman spent years doubting herself, questioning her own actions, living under a shadow of suspicion that had been created entirely by accident, by a single dollar bill falling from a coat pocket onto a Moscow sidewalk on a cold March evening in 1983.